The last time that the city of Rome was sacked by a foreign power was in 1527. In the waning years of the Renaissance, imperial powers fought all over the continent, and social movements like Martin Luther's Reformation shook the continent to its core and promised to fundamentally change society. In Italy, the Medici Pope, Clement VII, called the most unfortunate of the popes, trying to navigate a fraught political landscape, sparked a series of catastrophes that eventually resulted in the city of Rome being sacked by a mutinous imperial army for 8 months. It is history that deserves to be remembered. In Europe, the 16th century marked a shift from the Renaissance into the modern period, and was accompanied by major political and social shifts. The Renaissance had been a period of extreme power in Italy, where city-states like Florence and Venice fielded their own armies and fought with each other and foreign powers. The leaders of Florence, the Medicis, became so powerful and wealthy that they were able to elect their own popes. The fight for influence between the papacy and the empire was pronounced in northern Italy, where the fortunes of the two great powers waxed and waned in the Italian Wars, a series of wars fought between various powers between 1494 and 1559. Pope Clement VII was born Giulio de' Medici, nephew of Lorenzo Medici, otherwise known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. His father was killed a month before his birth, and Giulio was raised instead by Lorenzo, alongside his cousin, Giovanni, who would become Pope Leo X. He gained power quickly after Giovanni became pope, and within 3 months was made Archbishop of Florence. Giulio's reputation grew, and he was made the cardinal protector of both England and France. He and his cousin essentially ran the church as a team, and one cardinal described him as a man of great competence and great authority. He resides with the Pope and does nothing of importance without first consulting him. He was elected Pope himself in 1523. In 1525, Francis I, King of France, was defeated and captured in the Battle of Pavia. This shifted the power in Italy towards the empire, and Giulio, now Pope Clement VII, was worried about what that would mean for the church. He chose to seek an alliance that would rebalance the powers in the region, and allied himself first with Venice. When Francis was freed after signing the Treaty of Madrid, which ostensibly meant that he gave up any claim on Italy, he immediately pledged to support Clement. With Milan and Florence, this alliance became known as the League of Cognac. The political situation was far from stable. In 1526, an agreement between France and the Muslim Ottoman Empire, the first major agreement between a Christian and Muslim power, led Suleiman the Magnificent to invade Europe. Martin Luther was gaining power and prominence in the burgeoning Protestant Reformation and engendering animosity towards the Pope. And competing papal and imperial forces still battered over and within Italy, with pro-imperial forces led by the Cardinal Pompeo Colonna, member of a rival Italian family, even briefly wresting control of Rome from Clement in September of 1526. The imperial army of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V was made up of around 6,000 Spanish under Duke Charles III of Bourbon, about 14,000 German Landsknecht mercenaries, and a number of Italian mercenaries who supported the empire. A flurry of activity in northern Italy between the two powers resulted in no significant battles. The League's forces, for the most part, stayed in their fortresses and cities and didn't do much to impede the imperial army. And by March, the League's armies began to disband because the Pope could not afford to pay them. But the imperial army wasn't in much better shape. The emperor was also not sending money or supplies to his army. The imperial soldiers were restless, hungry, and poor. And when imperial allies in Italy refused to assist or feed the soldiers, they mutinied. The leader of the Landsknecht tried to talk them down, but suffered a stroke that would handicap him. Charles of Bourbon narrowly escaped the mutiny by hiding in a stable, but was able to talk the soldiers into an attack on Rome, his only chance of maintaining any kind of order within the force. He chose also to make it appear that he was marching on Florence to keep what soldiers the League had pinned in there. Sacking Rome itself was still no small act. The city was the center of the Catholic world, and by extension an important symbol for most of Europe. St. Peter's bones lay there, not to mention the church's library and the bodies of many other saints. Unfortunately for Rome, many of the German soldiers were followers of Martin Luther, and while Luther himself did not support attacking Rome, many of the soldiers saw it as a tempting target and a symbol of the corruption that Luther spoke against. Clement tried to work out a treaty to spare the city. Charles Lannoy was the imperial viceroy in Naples, an old friend of the emperor, and Clement believed a man of power and influence in Italy. He made a deal to pay 60,000 ducats to turn the soldiers away. The treaty made few people happy. Supporters of the war in Rome accused the Pope of selling out their allies and protecting only the Medici in Florence and the Church. When the Spanish soldiers of the imperial army heard the terms, they responded that they were almost laden with sins and must consequently seek absolution in Rome. Believing that Lannoy would be able to sell the treaty to Bourbon's army, the Pope disbanded parts of the Roman garrison to save money. While Bourbon and his army were at Arezzo at the end of April, the Florentines worried most about their own city. On April 26, they narrowly put down an attempt to overthrow Medici rule, but the chaos that ensued allowed Bourbon to pass by the city and reach the walls of Rome on May 5th, sacking and occupying several smaller cities on the way. There were only a few thousand soldiers left defending the city by then, and they clustered behind the Leonine Walls, first built in the 9th century by Pope Leo IV to defend against pirates. Most of the defenders were militia, led by a handful of Italian leaders and cardinals. With them were 189 Swiss Guard. Many in Rome still believed that the city was too strong to be taken. Its greatest defenses were its artillery, set into the wall at regular intervals. The imperial army nearby was in desperate condition. They were hungry. They were exhausted. They couldn't withstand a long siege. They didn't have proper siege equipment. They didn't even have proper ladders. Bourbon knew that his only chance of success was to attack the city fast and get over the walls, or he and his army would be destroyed. The imperial army attacked the city early in the morning of May 6th at 4 a.m., according to reports. The army was split into two parts, one made up of the imperial Spanish soldiers and the other the German Landsknecht. They attacked with hastily made ladders and in the initial fighting suffered heavy casualties against the fortified walls and artillery. As the morning wore on, a fog formed on the Tiber River and rolled towards the city, obscuring the artillerymen's view and forcing them to fire randomly. Bourbon, aware that his own fortunes relied on the success of the raid, strode to the front of the fighting to rally the troops. He wore, as he always did, a bright white cape and silver mail that made him easy to identify, both to his own troops and the enemy. He planted a ladder against the wall and stepped upon it, only to be shot an instant later. He fell on the field, crying, "I am dead." He was carried to a nearby chapel, where he died later that day. The death of the enemy leader sent a cheer through the defenders. Unfortunately for the Romans, the death had dire consequences for them and the city. Instead of fleeing, the enraged and now leaderless mob attacked with greater ferocity than ever. Philibert de Chalon, Prince of Orange, took charge of the army, but he had little authority, and in practice the army, already furious with the Pope, no longer had a leash. It's not certain exactly where a breach occurred first, but the first gate to fall was the Porta Torreon, assaulted by the Spanish and defended only by militia, who were decimated by the professional soldiers, especially as the Roman guns were captured and turned back on them. By 7:30 a.m., the imperial army was over the walls. The breakthrough was so unexpected that Pope Clement was in the Basilica of St. Peter's, praying. The Swiss Guard, along with the remnants of the crumbling militia, made a desperate stand at the foot of the Vatican obelisk, which now sits in St. Peter's Square, but at the time was in the cemetery outside the basilica, but fell almost to the man. Caspar Roast, the guard captain, was wounded, and later killed at his home, where he had found refuge, in front of his wife. 42 of the guard defended the Pope as he retreated with his entourage, with enemy soldiers so close that they could take pot shots at him. They retreated to the Pasetto, a secret passage which connects the basilica to the fortress of Sant'Angelo. The remaining guards, as well as other fugitives, were slaughtered on the very steps of the altar. Some escaped into the fortress, others falling from the drawbridge as it was retracted. Historian Judith Hook described the sack of the city to come as one of the most horrible in recorded history. With the Pope safe in the castle, Rome was left to the soldiers' mercy. It was now that the lack of leadership and the bitterness of German Lutherans and imperial soldiers was truly laid bare. The imperial soldiers executed civilians, stabled their horses in St. Peter's, and stole countless precious items, including almost all of the church's many artisan gold and silver wares. They stole tapestry based on pieces by Raphael, and even the Pope's tiara. One knight wrote in his memoirs, "On May 6th we took Rome by storm, put 6,000 men to death, took everything we could find in the churches or on the ground, and burnt a great part of the city." They stood in front of the Castle Sant'Angelo and shouted, "Long live Luther, Pope!" dressed as cardinals in the streets and decorated prostitutes in gold. They demanded that a priest give communion to a donkey, and when he refused, they beat him to death. They made a cardinal lay on a bier and then give his own eulogy. The few cardinals who were loyal to the empire fared little better, as they were dragged out of their homes, assaulted, and their homes robbed by the unruly mob. The Prince of Orange, though nominally in charge, had no control over the men, and only saved much of the papal library by setting his headquarters there, while soldiers set fires on the floors of churches and tore down altars. Monks were massacred, nuns and highborn women stripped and violated, and the tombs of popes and saints alike torn open. Even the tomb of St. Peter himself. The spear of Longinus, allegedly the spear that stabbed Jesus as he died on the cross, was stolen, as well as Constantine's golden cross. Ultimately, the cost and damage and lost goods is estimated to be as much as 10 million ducats, or 32 tons of gold. A leading Roman citizen described the terrors for the remaining civilians as the soldiers continued to sack the city. Many were suspended for hours by their arms. Many were cruelly bound by the genitals. Many were suspended by their feet high above the road or the river while their tormentors threatened to cut the cord. At the time of the attack, Rome had a population of about 55,000. Historians estimate that somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 were killed during the sack, and many more of disease in the months that followed as bodies piled up in the streets. The imperial soldiers made 6 attempts to take Sant'Angelo, where the Pope hid, but defended by the walls and artillery, he remained safe and even refused terms of surrender. The Duke of Urbino brought the allied army near the city, but despite the desperate state of the imperial army, refused to attack. Charles V sent no word of what to do next. Even Luther was silent on the tragedy. One historian called Luther's silence the most astonishing gap in the press landscape of the day. Left with few options, Clement came to terms and surrendered a month after the attack, on June 6th, while the Allied army remained timid in the countryside. He gave up control over a number of papal state cities, paid a hefty sum for his own life, and in December 1527 quietly slipped out of the city. Though it was against Catholic canon law, he grew a beard during his imprisonment as a display of mourning, which he never shaved. The imperial army finally left Rome in the summer of 1527, but a garrison remained until February of 1528. Clement would not return until October, to a city devastated and impoverished. He died in 1534. The War of the League of Cognac went on until 1530, though after the sack, Clement and the Papal States remained obsequious to the emperor. The emperor himself was embarrassed by the sack, for though he had once said, "I shall go into Italy and revenge myself on those who have injured me, especially on that poltroon, the Pope," the sack deeply affected the many European Catholics who held the city holy. The fall of Rome engendered sympathy for the Pope after years of corruption, and ironically helped to ensure that Charles would not eliminate the Papal States as a power. In fact, he later helped Clement reinstate the Medicis in Florence with an 11-month siege at the end of the war. Incidentally, Clement VII, virtually a prisoner of Charles, refused in 1527 to allow the annulment of English King Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, possibly, though not certainly, due to the fact that Catherine was the emperor's aunt. That refusal would beget the English Reformation. It took Rome centuries to recover and return to its former glory. The sack of Rome was the culmination of the many different factions and social movements that rose to power at the end of the Renaissance. It was emblematic of the great wealth and greed and deep divisions that drove the Italian wars of the 16th century. In fact, it was the great wealth in Florence and Rome that came as the result of the Renaissance that led to the rise of the Medici and their ascendance to the papacy. In honor of the bravery displayed at the famous Stand of the Swiss Guard, recruits in today's Pontifical Swiss Guards are sworn in on May 6th every year. The sack of Rome all but ended the role of the papacy as the primary patron of Renaissance art and architecture for decades. As a result, many historians consider the 1527 sack of Rome to mark the end of the Italian Renaissance. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.